There's a saying that every analogy limps. And what that means is when our Lord uses parables or uses an analogy, such as he does in today's gospel reading about the kingdom of heaven, there's some truth that he wants to convey, but if you analyze the parable or the analogy too much, you realize that not everything is quite the way that it should be. So, for example, what our Lord is trying to emphasize is the separation of the good and the bad. At the end of the age, at the end of time, when our Lord returns in glory, the angels will separate the good from the bad. So this is what our Lord wants to convey. But when we think of a net being cast into the sea and catching fish of every kind, it seems that it's against the will of the fish. In other words, if this is an analogy, it's kind of like God is capturing us without our will, without our consent. And once we're caught, we cannot escape, which is totally false. In fact, St. Augustine, he's a great theologian, doctor of the church. He has a deep insight into the spiritual life. And he makes the profound statement that it is easier for God to create the entire world out of nothing than to convert one human soul. And there's a number of reasons for this. Part of the reason is that God created us free, and he cannot oppose our freedom. So we must cooperate with the grace of God that he gives us. Now, he doesn't entice us or force us or seduce us in the way that the evil spirits do. Rather, he presents us with the truth, but we must choose it. And even when we choose to be followers of our Lord, we can say that it's difficult. It's difficult to be good. It's difficult to be virtuous. And sometimes it's difficult to avoid temptation to sin. And in fact, we could say that, well, even if we are on the way of following God, and even if we are at a high level of sanctity, even then we can easily turn and just embrace a life of sin. We can easily turn against God. In other words, we are not captured. We are free. We remain free. Interestingly enough, St. Paul, when he talks about sin, he says the very opposite. He says that sin enslaves us. It chains us. It binds us. We become addicted to sin and can't release ourselves from it. We need God to help us to be released from it. So, as I mentioned, every analogy limps, and it's good for us to reflect on these truths because the ideal is we want to be free. And when we are free, we can be free to follow the good, and we're also free to choose to do evil. Those who are addicted to sin, they're not free. It's very difficult, almost impossible for them to choose the good. And it's so easy for them to choose the evil because they're so addicted to it. So when the opportunity comes for that evil, whether it's, sensuality or glory or just pride, asserting ourselves over others or putting others down or whatever, maybe it's so easy to do that. But when the temptation comes, if we're addicted to that, it's kind of like we can't resist the temptation. We're not free. We're not free to choose otherwise. We're not free to not give in to that sin. So the slavery of sin. Now, I wanted to draw your attention to today's first reading also from the book of Exodus. We see how Moses, he puts the ark into the tabernacle or the tent, and there's this pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, and it basically leads the people through the desert. And they were in the desert for 40 years, and it was partially their fault because they were disobedient to God. But anyways, so God is manifesting his presence by means of this pillar of fire, this pillar of cloud. And all kinds of other signs, Moses' face shining, and so many things, and yet the people rebelled against God again and again. So here's God manifesting all kinds of miracles, manifesting his presence to them, manifesting the fact that he loves them and is with them and is guiding them through the desert, and yet they continually rebel against God. This is terrible. Now, we might say, well, if we were there at that time, we would be faithful to God. But you see, we tend to do the same thing. And we might say, well, God is not manifesting his greatness today. But the reality is that he is manifesting his greatness even today. So we have all kinds of miracles. We have all kinds of apparitions. We've got Eucharistic miracles. Recently in Missouri, in the United States, this nun, Sister Wilhelmina, she died 4 years ago, and at the end of April, the nuns of that Benedictine convent were going to move her body to a more suitable location, and in the process, they discovered that her body is incorrupt. A miracle. Great miracles like this. We've got so many miracles. We've got, all kinds of proofs, all kinds of evidence, the Shroud of Turin, and we can go on and on and on, near-death experiences, and yet people say, oh, well, God seems kind of distant from us. And people rebel against God, and people don't believe in God, and people abandon their faith. This is the reality that's happening. And there's a saying that familiarity breeds contempt. Familiarity breeds contempt. When we become familiar with something, when we become used to something, we don't appreciate it anymore. So the people, the Israelites in the desert, they didn't appreciate the presence of God. They didn't appreciate the miracles, the pillar of fire, the pillar of cloud. They kind of lost sight of the miraculous nature and what God was doing for them. And you see, the same thing tends to happen for us. We come to Mass so often, we tend to not appreciate. If we truly appreciated Mass on Sundays, we would put on our Sunday best. We would not talk in church. We would appreciate the presence of our Eucharistic Lord in the tabernacle. We would do all these things. We would truly focus on the reality of God's presence in our lives, and we would make more of an effort to grow in our relationship with him. But because we take him for granted, we take his presence for granted, we take the Mass for granted, we're not as devout as we could be, as we should be. I mentioned before, this story of Pope St. John Paul II. He related in one of his talks, I think, or maybe in his writings, I can't remember, but how in Poland, after the communists came and took away all the priests, and the people had no Mass, no access to confession. Every Sunday, the people of a town would gather, and there would be a chair up in the front of the church. The tabernacle was empty, of course. And on this chair, there was the priest's stole. And the people would just be there in church, weeping. They were weeping the fact that their priests are all gone, that they have no access to the Eucharist, that they do not have the Mass. C.S. Lewis, a great Christian author, he wrote many works and very profound insight into many things. He said, we will only truly appreciate something after we have lost it. We will only truly appreciate something after we have lost it. The Mass, the Eucharist, the many miracles in the church, the presence of God in our lives, the time that we have, the abilities, the opportunities that we have, we will only truly appreciate it after we have lost it, including the people in our lives. Just a brief reminder, tomorrow, Friday, it's the first Friday of the month, and we will once again have the all-night vigil of adoration after the 7:30 p.m. Mass in the evening.